Hi, I'm Hunter Bergman, the founder and marketing strategist for Experience Marketing. I'm also the producer and host of Build in Norfolk, a podcast that is a on-ramp to entrepreneurial education and innovation at Intersect Co-working and Incubator.
I'm Dustin Southworth. I'm the marketing and membership coordinator at the Norfolk Arts Center. And I am just a huge advocate of podcasts, and I am excited to get started in podcasting through the Arts Center. Hey guys, we're doing the How to podcast series going on, and we're starting out with some audio options. These are some devices that we have that can kind of get you started. So we're starting with some mobile devices. These will get you in. They're not too expensive. They'll get you some options. You can travel around, podcast as you're going. There's some awesome options. So over here, we can kind of get the man on the street kind of lav mics with the Rode. Rode is an awesome brand. It's high quality. You can go up and interview people that are with you. So it's an awesome option to have as well. We got a little bit of a cheaper option once you get into like the set down desktop version. So this is a Behringer. It's a very like minimal mixer that you can start off with. It plugs right into your computer. You get really good audio with that XLR. So now we have the bigger option once you are into podcasting and you really want to blow it out big. So we've got the Rodecaster Pro. This is the version 1, so this is the starting one. It gets you all the audio options that you can ever want. You can hook up 4 mics. You can do phone calls on this thing. It can do audio right into the Rodecaster, or you can run it into a laptop or desktop, and that'll get you all your audio, and you'll be able to do some amazing edits with that. So these are the audio options that we have that can kind of go through from very cheap to very expensive. Hey guys, we're back with the How to podcast series. Today we're talking about video and lighting. So we've got a bunch of options for you, and we're going to start off with your phone, the thing that everybody has in their pocket. So you can start with the kind of cheap tripod, get it from Walmart, wherever. So you're going to set it up on the tripod. You're going to put it on your face, and it's going to be a great option for you. So if you want to kind of step up from that, we kind of recommend going with a GoPro. You'll get good 1080 to 4K video with that. It's a good option to step up. But if you want to kind of get the more depth, the higher quality video, you're going to want to step up to, I recommend a mirrorless camera, because you can get long, you can do 30 minutes or more on a mirrorless camera without it overheating. That's kind of a great option for that. If you want to try something really fun to kind of immerse people into the podcast, go with a 360 cam. We got this Max here, and it is an awesome option to kind of jump into that 360. So we got some lighting options as well, because you're going to need that with your video. You always want to look good. You want to get good lighting on your face to be able to see everybody that's in it. So starting off, we recommend a ring light to kind of get started. The one thing about it is it just is kind of flat lighting across your face. It's going to be one thing. But if you want to kind of step up from that, we recommend getting like an LED flat panel. If you get multiple of those, you'll be able to set them up kind of on opposite sides, kind of get depth into your image, and that's going to really enhance your video once you get into that. Thanks for watching.
The first video in our series, we're actually going to talk about developing a mission charter with this podcast worksheet. So go to the description or go to the Norfolk Arts Center's page where you can actually download this How to Podcast worksheet, and that's kind of what we're going to be going through so you can follow along. So the first section is we're really going to talk about, first of all, why do you want to start a podcast? You know, Dustin, we've talked, you and I, about, you starting the Norfolk Arts Center podcast, and I have got the Build in Norfolk podcast. And really, I think if you have that really strong North Star of what story do you want to tell, who do you want to highlight, and really thinking about who do you want to talk to, right? For our Build in Norfolk podcast, our whole goal is to target, young people who want to start a business, but also, people between 30 to 50 or 60 who have industry experience who are looking to innovate. So that's kind of why I started my podcast in the North Star. Why do you think you wanted to start a podcast for the Norfolk Arts Center?
I think we just want to get our brand out there and get the culture of Norfolk out there among people from the greater Nebraska area and even beyond. I mean, we want to show what we're about and why the Norfolk Arts Center loves Norfolk.
I think you should also, you should definitely have like a why are you starting the podcast, right? And then you should also really dial into what value you're providing for your listeners. Is it a value bomb, or is it tactical resources that they can use to start a business, or actually getting a first-hand look inside the culture? So be very specific on what that value is that you're providing in each episode so that you can consistently bring that in through each episode. Lastly, I think always definitely start with a podcast goal. So my goal is for Build in Norfolk is to really just have a presence and foster an entrepreneurial ecosystem in our local Norfolk community, but really create those connections offline too as well. So Build in Norfolk is a podcast, but we also have in-person events where entrepreneurs can meet up and hang out and really connect.
And the Arts Center podcast is going to kind of have a deeper connection with the artists that we bring in, the people that are in the community, and just drive people to the Arts Center in general and Norfolk.
Awesome. So for that first section, really figure out your why, who's going to listen, what value you're consistently providing each episode, what's the overall theme of your podcast, and then really start with that podcast goal, that driver of every episode. What's that one nugget of takeaway that you want to provide for your listeners and what you want to achieve with your podcast? So stay tuned for more information on how to start a podcast. Welcome back to the second episode of our How to Podcast mini-series, where we are actually diving through how you can start a podcast. So right now we're actually following along with our How to Podcast strategy worksheet, which you can find on the Norfolk Arts Center's page, or you can also go to xpm.agency/podcast. So in this episode, we're going to talk about structure and guest. So there's some really important things to this, right?
Absolutely.
With my podcast, Build in Norfolk, I don't necessarily have a co-host. And so, really that's going to be a big question for you is, do you want to get a co-host to help you, carry the conversation? And honestly, I've had podcasts before where I've had a co-host, and I really like the dynamic. If it's fun, you can build the energy off each other. And then you can also invite guests on to kind of build up the catalog and library.
Right. Yeah. And we will probably have at least two of us to kind of get different experiences and get from different perspectives in the Norfolk Arts Center. So we'll have our program coordinator and me in the marketing side of it. So we'll kind of get those perspectives and have that conversation.
You can really build up that energy with a co-host. Some other things to think about are what are the criteria for your guests? So, if you're having for me, Build in Norfolk, we are pretty much interviewing entrepreneurial ecosystem advocates or entrepreneurs themselves or key players that are helping, boost up local entrepreneurs or entrepreneurs in the Nebraska ecosystem. And so I would be really specific about who you want to invite on your guests. So then you can actually talk to those people. I think one of the reasons why you could start a podcast or want to start a podcast is actually to build your network. I actually started this, with the Commonwealth Media podcast, where I was the co-producer and the production assistant. And so what I pretty much did was I just set the cameras up, but I got to meet some really cool people. So that's one reason why you might want to start a podcast. Some other important things about your structure and guests are to think about how long your podcast is going to be. So the Build in Norfolk podcast, I really try to make it just a little tidbit of the moment. So maybe 30 minutes to 45 minutes, but if you really have some fun conversation, you could go for 2 hours. But I would say really that the shorter the episodes, the more likely some people will listen to it. There's a fun podcast that I know of that they just do a 10-minute episode. It's called 10, and they literally just go in, they set their timer for 10 minutes, they podcast, have the conversation, and then they kind of transition out of that. So those are some things to think about. Another piece is, will you have audio and video? And so Dustin and I actually had a conversation, that will kind of, in our series about audio equipment and video equipment that you could use, but that's another thing to kind of think about that goes into there. So the last thing to think about is where you're going to record, right? Is it going to be in your living room, on your couch? Is it going to be, in the Norfolk Arts Center or in the Intersect co-working and incubator podcast room? So I think that's another kind of last piece of information.
Yeah, it's all good things to think about when you're putting together and thinking about all the structure and everything.
And it's totally, you can absolutely be flexible. And in later videos, we'll actually talk about the audio equipment that you can use to get started and take that first step. So stay tuned as we continue to work through this strategy worksheet and help you start a podcast.
Welcome back to our How to podcast series. This is the third episode. We're going to be talking about pre-production today. This is kind of the things to think about when you're getting started. Before you go in and jump in to record, you're going to think about all kinds of things.
What is pre-production, some might ask? So pre-production is all the preparation and planning that goes into actually shooting an episode, right? So if you have a guest, lining up the guest, hey, checking with them, hey, are you going to be here at this time? Also doing research. As a podcast host, I really think it's so important that you do background research on all your guests. Again, it really depends on the theme of your podcast. If you're just here to hang out with your friends, and I think it is cool to do some research on, why did they take the submarine down to the Titanic, or some things that really, maybe we say that. Did we not say that?
I don't know. That might go to that timely part. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know if that was okay to say on your, because people did die.
Yeah.
Maybe we can cut that out. Okay. We're back for the pre-production section here. And pre-production is really all of the planning and preparation that goes into the podcast. So when are you going to shoot? Where are you going to shoot? Who are you going to shoot with? What equipment are you going to need? The research that would maybe go into the interview, and maybe the key questions for that. I actually have also attached to that How to Podcast worksheet. We actually have in there a structure for a 30 to 45 minute episode for you already put together, so that you can easily grab that and go. Some other things to think about, are before you shoot every episode, actually you're in the actual studio, really making sure that the equipment is checked out. You have your SD card space, you've got room. I don't know how many times I've recorded video and I was like, oh man, I have no space on there.
Right.
Also, again, really making sure that you have that outline, you're ready to rock and roll, just creates a professional workspace. Stay tuned as we continue to go through How to Podcast.
Welcome back to the How to Podcast series. Now we're going to be talking about production. So this is thinking about once you're in the recording studio, you're there, you have the mixer in front of you. What all things do you need to have ready to go? Are you going to run out of space right away? Are you going to, are all of your XLR mics hooked up at the time? So this is getting started, how to get that started.
So there are a few things that you need to know during the production process. Equipment choice. Are you going to use, currently we have a Rodecaster Pro set up with a the Rode Pod mics on here. If you're podcasting at the Intersect Co-working Incubator space, you will actually be using a Rodecaster Pro on there. So this is an expensive option, right? However, you can use your phone to record your first episode with you and your friends hanging out. So it doesn't really matter what it is, but definitely thinking about the equipment that you're going to use is important. The second thing that you're going to need to think about is the software. So in terms of editing the actual podcast, this is where we go to post-production, but are you recording onto your computer locally, or are you recording onto just an SD card and then you'll put that in post-production for later? So production can be defined as all things like Dustin mentioned, the actual shooting and recording of that episode. And so really making sure that you know exactly what equipment you're going to use. Are you going to use video too as well? If so, what kind of cameras are you going to use? Those are some really important things. I kind of have a production checklist on that How to Podcast strategy worksheet that we've been going through in each video. And right now in the production section, there is a checklist that says, check your gear, check your storage space, record the room noise. I don't know how many times I've finished a podcast and I forgot to record just a noise plate is what they call it. So that way you can go back and isolate anything in post-production so that it sounds better. However, if you're podcasting in the Intersect Co-working Incubator podcast room, we actually have that all set up for you to be noise cancellation and everything, so you don't even need to worry about that.
One of the other things to think about is how many different types of microphones you can use. So you can most people start with probably USB mics. A lot of people use the Blue Yeti Snowball mic. That's one of the first podcasting ones that I've seen. Then you kind of jump up to wireless, then you can jump over to XLR. But then there's also different kinds of XLR mics if you do cardioid or dynamic. So these are all things to think about when you're starting up production.
And we're here to help. And so we actually recorded a video describing the different types of microphones and what maybe might work best for you. To get started, feel free to use your phone. But the next step up is buying a simple Behringer, kind of what is this? A mixer.
One XLR mixer.
One XLR mixer that this would go straight into your computer, record to a digital audio workspace, which is called a DAW. And so that would just record direct locally, and then you could edit that on post-production or Premiere Pro, or you can use Final Cut, Logic, or Audacity has a nice free software that you can use. But that is our production episode. If you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment. Again, we're all following along to this How to Podcast Strategy worksheet. So if you have any questions, reference that worksheet and let us know how we can help you out. Stay tuned for more ways on how you can start a podcast.
Welcome back to our How to podcast series. This is episode number 5. We're going to be talking about post-production. So this is one of the most important parts to think about. So after you've gone through all the checklists that we have in our podcast worksheet for coming up with ideas and going through the audio equipment that you need and the video equipment, this is post-production. So you got to think about, start thinking about, are you going to do the podcast editing? That's one of the most tedious parts of podcasting.
I was going to say, the Build Norfolk podcast, shout out to Emma Bennett. She's been super patient with us as we produce that. However, that is a shortfall that I've kind of learned for myself is I love hosting it. I love the pre-production, production process, but sometimes the post-production process can be a little tedious. So we actually put some questions together to kind of help you make that an easy transition. So one of the biggest questions is, who's going to edit it, right? You were talking about if you're not going to, who's going to? You can find somebody on Fiverr super cheap. You can also contact us at xp.agency. We would love to chat about your podcast needs. Or again, just simply, uploading it raw, right? Some types of podcasts, you can have customized intros and outros. So if you listen to the Build Norfolk podcast, we have a customized intro with music that we kind of created to be a little introduction vibe. So really thinking about, is that what you want to do? Or do you want to have a unique intro for every episode? So it's, hey, welcome to episode 11. We're going to talk about boom, boom, boom with so-and-so. For the Build Norfolk podcast, we just have a standard introduction. We just have the little tagline, we have some music, and then I just go straight into the episode. Whereas also, you could also do a live intro and outro. You could literally just say, hey, welcome to the Norfolk Arts Center podcast. I'm here with Dustin Southworth and Hunter Bergman, and we're going to talk about how to build a podcast. So a couple different ways you can kind of structure that, but we have some things in here that really can give you maybe a direction on what to do. So continue to stay tuned as we go through how to start a podcast.
Welcome back to our How to Podcast series. This is episode number 6. We're going to get into distribution of your podcast, how to get started with getting it out to the people. How do you get it out to the people? Where do you go?
And that's the thing. You can record an episode, but it's important that people can listen to it.
Absolutely. So there are a lot of options out there. Goes from free to very expensive real quick. So some of the ones that we kind of recommend in the podcast worksheet that you guys can find on our website, on social medias between the two of us.
You can also go to xpm.agency/podcast and find it on our website.
Yeah. So starting out free, Anchor by Spotify, one thing to keep in mind, is a free option to put out there, and that gets you full distribution on all the platforms. That's a great choice to get started. When you're not sure how far you want to go with your podcast, how to get started and everything, put it out on Anchor, get it started, get your RSS feed going, and then you can think about moving up to these other ones. So there are some great choices. So Podbean is another great choice. It has customizable pages, you get interactions. It's amazing to put out there.
We actually host Build in Norfolk on Buzzsprout. And the difference between maybe Anchor / a Buzzsprout or maybe a Podbean is really the in-depth analytics. You can actually switch out intros, outros, and ads on the actual platform as well. And I'm sure Anchor has a paid version of that too. However, we chose Buzzsprout because of its simplicity and ease of use in terms of pushing it out to different kind of platforms. So when we talk about these distribution platforms, we're talking about, how do I get on Spotify? How do I get on iTunes? Is it iTunes? Yeah. Apple Music now, or Apple Podcasts, or Google Podcasts. So how you get onto those is by using a podcast distribution platform, such as Anchor, Buzzsprout, Podbean, or Libsyn. So, those are the things that you can use for your podcast. So go ahead and check out Anchor. And again, we are following along on our How to Podcast worksheet. Definitely check that out. And also, this is a quick plug for our How to Podcast where we actually talked with individuals who had, quite a few years of podcast experience. And they're actually the hosts of the Growing Small Town Nebraska podcast. And they have a really great perspective from starting their podcast from start to finish. We also talk about some great marketing tips. So continue to stay tuned as we help you start your podcast. Welcome back. I'm Hunter Bergman.
I'm Dustin Southern.
And we're actually helping you start a podcast with our How to Podcast mini-series. And this is the last episode in our series, and where we actually, just went through the How to Podcast strategy worksheet. You can actually go to xpm.agency/podcast and find it there, or you can also navigate to the Norfolk Arts Center Facebook page and find it there to kind of watch all of our content. So in this episode, we're actually going to chat about kind of closing out, right? So you did all that work, you went through and you filled out our worksheet, and you're ready to start your podcast. You recorded your first episode, you got Anchor, you're on Anchor, and you're ready to go. Now what do you do next? What do you do next, Dustin?
Now you got to market it, and you got to brand it, and you got to do all the things that goes along with that. It's an exciting time and a scary time once it's actually going out to the people at that point. You just got to get it out there, start networking with people, and start making those connections.
If you go ahead and listen to the actual How to Podcast that we recorded, we actually talk with Sheila Jenkinson, who's a co-host of the Growing Small Town Nebraska podcast, and she gives kind of her marketing rundown strategy and what's maybe working best for her. So my perspective too with Building Norfolk, is everybody, maybe 1 out of 10 people are going to listen to a podcast, but really leverage the social media sphere. If it's graphics or whatever that looks like, definitely make sure that you're leveraging those platforms, whether it's your own personal social medias or you've created the social medias. It's really important that you do have a digital presence where people can kind of find you and listen to your episodes. But, definitely check out that episode for more in-depth marketing insights. However, in this episode, we want to just give you some encouragement, right? Go ahead and just start. I want to look back to some of the first episodes of my early days. If you go to theviewpoint.com, I believe it's .com. It's the local newspaper, or the newspaper for students on campus at Northeast, where I actually did podcasts. I interviewed individuals to highlight the diversity on campus. It was a ton of fun, but I totally recommend recording the first 5 episodes. So record 1 episode, edit it, listen to it, share it with your friends. Hey, did you like it? Do you love it? Record number 2. Hey, did you like it? Did you love it? Learn from that. Go to number 3, go to number 4, go to number 5. And then once you've done 5 of those episodes, you're definitely going to have a good idea of what do you like, what do you not like, and what's kind of your, Sheila talks about this formula, this podcast formula that they've created. So that's kind of my tidbits and last bits of information. Do you have any last kind of words for our listeners and viewers?
Well, as I said, just get started. I think that's the most important thing. But have decent quality on your first episode, because that's the one that everybody's going to hear. And then just move forward from there. And like I said, just kind of, you're going to start to get into that rhythm, that formula. You're going to figure out the type of questions that you like to ask. All that stuff is going to kind of come naturally once you kind of get going, get those, like, I think they say most people don't finish their first 10 episodes. So you get those 5, you feel comfortable, and then you kind of get on a roll, and you just keep going. Just keep going.
Just keep putting the content out there. I think the enemy of progress is perfection. So, like I said, start with your first 5, chop it up. And again, going back to the very first thing that we talked about in our first episode of this mini-series is, what's your why? Why did you want to start a podcast in the first place? Because it can also become something you mentioned before in your podcast space, working with your partner, that sometimes it gets, it's hard. It's not easy to go ahead and start a podcast. So maybe be clear on what you would like to get out of it. There are a couple different things, that I've seen personally is really building up your own personal brand, being branded as that specific podcast guy. 2, you can also build your network up. Hey, do you want to be on my podcast on, talking with artists about the culture of Norfolk, or talking to entrepreneurs in Nebraska? Or number three, you can actually build it to build your brand, or maybe it's for your company, right? I think this is a great way to showcase how much of a human we actually really are, right? When you have a series, you can do internal communications. You can actually do like internal culture building, right? So talking about maybe it's not necessarily like advertising your products, but really showcasing maybe your core values and the mission of your company, right? Why do you exist? What do you hope to set out? Maybe you're actually talking to customers about their journey on the road to success, or how maybe your product has helped them. But really never forget the number one element of storytelling, right? I just want to kind of end with that. We don't get too super long-winded for our mini series here. But if you have any other questions, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn or Dustin on
the Norfolk Art Center Facebook page, all of our social medias.
Mm-hmm. Yep, absolutely. That was kind of our mini series. If you have any other questions, comments about the worksheet, or how maybe you can get started, go ahead and hit us up, leave a message on any of these comments, and we're happy to help you out. So have a wonderful rest of the week, and happy podcasting.